Okay, everybody. So, Genesis, the beginning, and today is the beginning of the beginning. I want to say a couple of words about it, and then we'll dig in. So you could ask, um, we think about Genesis, oh, it's the first book of the Bible, it's where things start. But you could ask, why? Why does the Bible begin with Genesis? That is to say, what do we need the book of Genesis for? Why is it there? And this is not a new question. Um, and I'll give you one answer, which is quite surprising, but also quite relevant, I think, to the world we live in. So Rashi, in his commentary, quotes a scholar of one of the ancient rabbis who actually lives about 800 years before Rashi. So we're talking about, maybe the third century. His name was Rabbi Yitzhak, and he says, why doesn't the Torah begin with the first mitzvah? Right? So his idea is, well, it's a book of mitzvot. It's all about God's commandments. And in fact, we say, well, the Torah has 613 commandments. So that must be what it's about. So he says that if that's the case, why doesn't it begin there? And that is the laws of Passover. Why does it begin here? And he says the reason is to say that God created the world, and when people accuse the Jewish people of being thieves because they stole the land of the seven Canaanite nations, God can say, the Israelite can say, God made the world, God can give it to whoever God chooses. So that, for Rabbi Yitzhak, is why we have Genesis. Right? To defend the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Now, it's very polemical and it reflects his own time, but it's interesting he says it. It's interesting that Rashi quotes it. And it's interesting that there are those in this world today who are still saying that Israel, the country as a whole, I'm not even talking about the West Bank, they're thieves. They've stolen other people's land. Right. So I mentioned that not because I think that's why we start with Genesis, but because it's relevant to the world we live in, and it shows just how old these claims are. Um, if you want to think about why it starts with Genesis, the Bible is the story of a particular people, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and their descendants. And that people who goes into Egypt and is redeemed and travels through the wilderness, ultimately comes to the promised land. But the Bible is interested in something that's more universal as well. And that's the relationship of people to other people, not just Jewish people, the relationship to us, of our relationship to God, our relationship to the environment. So you can see that in the opening chapter of Genesis, right? So it's, in a sense, the Bible is not a narrow book of laws at all, though it contains many laws. It's about far more than that, and it's about far more than the Jewish people. So, having said that, I want to also mention something about approach. Um, there are those who want, and fairly well established, to say, well, the Bible and even the book of Genesis is really a compendium. It's not one author, it's a series of authors. And that explains, for example, some of the contradictions that we find. We're going to see that the story of Genesis in chapter 1 is different and contradictory to the story of Genesis in chapter 2. So modern scholarship simply says, oh, those are two different sources, right? And they were combined together. It's worth noting, and I'm noting it, but that's not going to be my focus. I'm not really interested in taking the Bible, the Torah apart to understand what different sources are and how they keep recorded. I'm going to look at it as a whole, as a divinely inspired single document, however it came into being. Right? I want to take it at its face value. I'm interested in it as a work of law, also philosophy and literature. When we look at the book of Genesis, there's a lot of literature and all these stories. It is in some ways a book of stories with some notable exceptions. So that really brings me to beginning at the beginning. And we are going to go extremely slowly, because there is just so much packed in. So we're going to start with chapter 1, verse 1. The book I'm using is the Eitz Chaim Chumash, which I think is a really good translation, though not the best. The best one is probably by Robert Alter. It's a very recent modern translation. I will tend to read God, not read God as masculine, because I don't think God is masculine. And so you'll see me say God a lot as opposed to he. Okay, so it begins, let's start here. It begins with the letter Bet, the Hebrew letter Bet. And that's notable for a couple of reasons. First of all, it doesn't begin with Aleph, which is the first letter of the alphabet. So when it starts, we're already into the Hebrew alphabet, right? And that's notable because, in a sense, the Torah has no beginning, and in some sense has no ending. It's a circle. We read it in synagogue over the course of a year up to Simchas Torah, and that day we start again. We're at the beginning, but we're not. And in classical texts, it never begins on page 1. If you look at the Eitz Chaim, it's page 3. And in general, Jewish books, scholarly, rabbinic texts generally begin on the second page. Just a way of saying we never begin studying and we never end studying. Okay. So now that gets me to the first word. Oh, one more thing about Bet. You can see how slowly we're going to go. If you have a Hebrew part to your Bible, and you look at the Hebrew side, if you look at the letter Bet, it looks like it looks like a square with one side missing, right? Sort of like that. Maybe it's reversed on your screen, but right, comes across good. So it's open on one side and closed on the other, right? So it's like a square with one side open. Right? So the rabbis say we're only able to look forward and not backward. And we should not speculate. No, there's a whole mystical literature that it does exactly that. But the rabbis say, and it's Kabbalah, rabbis say, don't think about what came first. And the reason they say that is it's going to begin, Bereshit bara Elohim, God created. So don't worry about where God came from, right? God is seen as existing in the Torah before anything. Now, the classic translation here, if you go back to King James, right, go back to the earliest translation, Jewish Publication Society, not the more recent one, which was done in the 60s, but the early one. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, right? Which is to say, there was nothing before. It was the very beginning. In the beginning, God created. But that is not really what the Hebrew says. And this is noted as, very early by Rashi and other scholars. The word Bereshit means in the beginning of, and then bara Elohim, God created. So it's not in the beginning of, it's not in the beginning God created, but in the beginning of God creating the heaven and the earth were da 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 da. In other words, the heaven and the earth pre-exist. This is when God begins to make the universe, right? And it's going to be a process of moving from chaos to order. That's creation in general. If you want to think about, there are three things we'll see going on. One, chaos becomes order. Two, things get separated. And three, things get named. That seems to be part of what it means. Otherwise, it's just kind of an unformed mass. Now, the word bara here, which is translated as create, is a specific kind of word. It only refers to God. In other words, if I want to say creating in Hebrew, anybody, any other way, people creating, you don't use the word bara. Mm-hmm. So this suggests that this is not the kind of process that people use when they create. Right? God is on a different plane. God's creation is on a different plane. And we can't sort of conceptualize or understand God's creation because it's so different from anything that human beings do. Now, having said that, we're still going to have a description of it, right? But it's important to know that we're talking about God language. Okay, so we've gotten through two words. Now look, it's the third word, Elohim, right? So Elohim is, first of all, it's a plural, right? But the verb is always singular, right? So even there are certain words in Hebrew that are like mass nouns. The word water in Hebrew is mayim, it's plural, but it's referring to one thing, right? Here, Elohim means, and it can mean a reference to gods, plural. The term in Hebrew, Elohim acherim, other gods. It's one way of saying it. This is God singular. It is one being, but it is not God's name, which we'll see in chapter 2. It's a generic category, the category of God, to which, in our tradition, only one being inhabits that category. There's only one God, but we could refer to other gods, the gods of the pagans, and we would use the same word. Now, to make this even more complicated, in other contexts, not this, context that we will see, Elohim actually means judges. It'll be used in a secular human context to mean simply judge. You'll take a person to the judges at the gate, and the word there is Elohim also. So a little confusing. Here, it means God. And God generically, this is God with a capital G, right? Okay. So when God began to create, and now we go to Hashamayim v'ha'aretz, the heavens and the earth. This is called, amongst literary scholars, called the Hendiates. It's something which means it's all, we say one thing, we say the opposite. It means to include everything, right? So when God began to create, I wouldn't say heaven and earth. In some ways, I would say the universe, the totality, everything. What was happening at that moment? What was going on? What existed? And here we get chaos. The earth is unformed and void, and there's darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind sweeping over the water. So it is in this environment, from this environment, that God is going to create everything. So what does it mean, the deep? It's watery, whatever it is. The word in Hebrew is tahom, which is closely related to an ancient Babylonian word, Tiamat, which was actually the name of a Babylonian goddess. But it's clearly not a reference to that here. Anyway, and then I said a wind sweeping over the water. So the problem here, and this is another use of the word Elohim, meaning God, Ruach Elohim, a God wind, can also mean a mighty wind, right? So either it's a wind that God has sent, or it's simply a great wind, a howling void, right? Undifferentiated. And into that void, we have a voice. Vayomer Elohim, and God said, Yehi or, let there be light. May there be light. Vayehi or, and there was light. So, how does God create? Through speech, at least here. But in general, how does God create? Through speech. There is a line that we use in liturgy, in our prayers, Baruch Sha'amar v'haya olam. Blessed be the one who spoke and the world came into being. I think one of the reasons that Judaism is so concerned with speech, and particularly with lashon hara, sort of evil speech, slander, gossip, things like that, is because speech creates reality. Right? When you characterize something as something, there is a reality to that. If you badmouth somebody, it creates a certain reality. All right, speech creates. Naming things create. What do scientists do, if you think about it? Some kinds of scientists, particularly early on, they gave things names because that's how they knew they were different from other things, right? And it kind of brought them into focus, into reality. So speech is enormously powerful. This is divine speech. And it is in the language of human beings. That is, God said. Now, what does that mean exactly? We say, well, God said. Does God have a mouth? Does God talk? So you could say, I think the Bible in general uses very anthropomorphic language. And you know from the Passover Seder, God redeemed us with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and so on. But it's clear, I think, that these are metaphors. The closest thing we know to this process, which is unique to God, we have to somehow call it something. So it's termed speech. But be clear that this is sort of a mysterious process, as is seeing, right? Because it now goes on to say, Vayar Elohim et haor, and God saw that light which God has created, hitov, that it is good. So that's interesting in itself. What does it mean that it is good? And why does creation start with light at all, right? And you can think about, in some ways, I think if you think about theater, right? You think about the lights come on and then it begins. I think it's really interesting, and we'll talk about this a bit later on. We talk about Genesis. I don't think the book of Genesis is a history book, and I don't think it's a book of science, right? It's not. I believe in evolution. I believe the world is very, very old, far older than the book of Genesis would suggest. I don't think that's, to use modern, I don't think that's the project of Genesis to tell us how the world came into being in a scientific way. I think it's about other things. Now, having said that, I think it's interesting that the Torah begins with light, which is the one constant in our universe. Like the speed of light can't be changed. Everything can be measured against it. It's kind of yardstick, if you will. And it's just, I think it's probably a coincidence, but it's quite a striking coincidence to note that. At any rate, remember I said differentiation, separation, and here we get the first one. Oh, before that, God saw that it was good. So there's also valuation. Not, in other words, God acknowledged the rightness of this. This is going well, right? Light also is associated with goodness in the Jewish tradition. Think about Purim, right? La Yehudim hayat orah v'simcha. For the Jews, this is at the end, right? They had light and joy, right? Orah v'simcha, right? There is a sense that this is, and light is associated with God in general in the Bible. The burning bush, right? That isn't being consumed. There's light there. And it seems to be a representation of God's presence, not God in the bush, but God's presence and manifestation in the bush. So what does God do? Having created this good light, V'yavd Elohim, and God makes a separation between day and night, or I'm sorry, light and darkness. And then God names, separation, naming, and God calls the light, the light day, and calls the darkness night. And it was evening and it was morning of the first day, a first day. I would say actually the best translation is it was evening and morning, day one. Because later on, we're going to talk about the second day, the third day, but here it's not that. It's Yom, the first Yom. It's not, the Hebrew word is not first here. Yom Echad doesn't mean first. So, okay. Let's be clear that this day and night are not the day and night we think about. Because we're not going to see the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars until the fourth day, right? So what does it light and darkness, day and night have to do here? What are we talking about? I'll come back to that when we look at the sun, the moon, and the stars. How long is a day? Hard to say, since the length of a day is actually determined by the Earth going around the sun and all of those things and the spinning of the Earth. So, there are those who say, yeah, it says 6 days, but who knows what a day is? There is something to that. Okay, we have covered Yom Echad, day one of creation. And now I want to give you the opportunity, if you have any questions on anything I've said so far, I'm going to pause and open it up. And if you do have a question, please, if you're muted, please unmute. Anybody at all? Any questions? Saul, then Sandy, then Barry.
Did you mention anything about the bet, the first letter, and being enlarged?
Yeah. Oh, you're right. I did not. So there are letters in the Bible, in the Torah in general, that are enlarged. For example, in the word echad in the Shema, right? The first and last letters are enlarged, and that spells aid, which means witness, right? Some letters are big, some letters are small. It's unclear to me why the first letter of the Torah is enlarged. It certainly emphasizes beginning, right? Think about some books, some typefaces that do that. They have like a big letter and then small letter. So it may be more stylistic. These things are not, these traditions, including the vowels and what have you, are later. They're Masoretic. Originally, the Bible doesn't have any of this, doesn't even have punctuation, right? So unclear, I would say, but worth noting. And if I can find any explanations, I'll make a note here and I can mention it next time. Okay, why? Other questions, Sandy?
By the way, Walter's tried like 10 times to get into the room, but anyway. Okay, I have two things, if I could please. One is in Joe Rosenstein's Pirkei Avot book, he talks about a pre-Torah where it actually has a blueprint for the Torah of what God's supposed to,
Yes.
what God does.
So that's an ancient midrash, and it's based around, and the midrash is that God looks into the Torah as a kind of blueprint and consults it in order to create the world. It's based around the following midrash. The first word is Bereshit, and you could read it in the beginning, when God began, or you could say, with Reshit, with, quote, Reshit, God created heaven and earth. Elsewhere in the Torah, the Torah itself is considered Reshit Darko, the beginning of God's ways. And so this midrash very cleverly says, with Reshit, and then takes from over there that Reshit means Torah and plugs it in. So it becomes with Torah, God created. So this is a midrash. It's certainly not the intent of the text, but what I think the midrash means to suggest is that this is a world that God creates that's meant to be aligned with Torah. This is a world in which God wants to see Torah and those principles lived out, that's the intention of creation. That's a kind of sermon, if you will. That's what midrash often was. It's homiletical, but it's not what it means. Clearly, it doesn't mean. You said you had two things.
Yeah, thank you. Just a comment, another example, you spoke about light, and when Moses came down from the mount, wasn't there this glow around him of light when he came down with the second set of 10 commandments?
Yes, and that again is the sense of light being representative in some sense of God's presence, contact with God, divinity in general. And that's not just in the Jewish tradition, it was all across Mesopotamia. It's a very common sense that, and we think of it today, right? Or think of the Christian tradition of angels that have halos right around their head, all of that. Okay, Barry.
Yes, well, modern cosmologists have trouble with what came before the beginning. So there's
there's
a Big Bang theory.
Yeah, I mean, and
before the Big Bang.
Yes, and one
very
say, well, the
open question, which is
right,
in many cases is void.
Yes, and perhaps unanswerable.
Now, in the case, so in the case of the Bereshit, perhaps what the beginning we're talking about is the beginning of the material world, and that there's an existing spiritual world.
I think that's true. I'm not sure that the Torah wants to distinguish between the material and the spiritual. It's striking to me, for example, that it says it's good, right? Already we're beyond just materiality into something else. We will see a reference to later on to what looks like God consulting other spiritual beings. I don't think, and we'll talk about that when we get there, I don't think that you can make that distinction clearly we as modern people, we want to make a distinction between the body and the spirit, or the body and the soul. I'm not sure that ancient Judaism saw a difference. It was all integrated.
And, yeah, just and I also have a question. So, when were the angels created?
Yes. Well,
And
we
what are some of
we
the
don't know.
thoughts about
Right?
that?
Yeah, this is about when God began to create heaven and earth. So other stuff happened first. Maybe the creation of the angels, if you want to go in that direction, took place then. It's clear, right, that in a sense, God pre-exists everything. Right? Like he was, he is, he will be. This is what we say in liturgy, right? Everything comes from God, emanates from God. But the translation that we're using, when God began to create, does allow for other things to have happened before, as opposed to in the beginning, God created. Okay. If there's nothing else, I want to jump in, and then we can get to the second day. Okay. So we're up to verse 6. So far, we have day and night. So again, God speaks, and God says, may there be a rakia. Here it's expanse in the midst of the water, separating water from water. Right, so you have undifferentiated, just this watery mass, and you now have light and wind. And now, so rakia seems to be, I mean, it's used elsewhere, I don't think here. It's used as a kind of beaten plate, right? A physical barrier, a separation, no earth, just water. And now we have upper water and lower water. Okay? Now, the upper water is, as we're going to see, well, let's just fit. God made this, separated the waters, that which was below from that which was above. And now we get first separation, then we get naming, right? And God saw it, God named it, God called the expanse sky, and there was an evening and the morning of the second day. So up here, above it, we have sky. Below it, it's waters. So and this is the ancient world, very different from our own, right? They think about the sky as a kind of fixed thing. They don't have a concept of, well, there's outer space and it goes up and the oxygen gets thinner and thinner. No, there's a plate, there's sky, and if you look up, what you're seeing actually is water. When we come to the flood, it's going to say that God opened the water gates of heaven and allowed the water to come down. Right? That there's water up there. And so we think about, well, it rained for day and night. Yes, 40 days. But the kind of imagery here is of separation, water on top, water on the bottom. Now, what is missing here from the second day? Because we're going to go on and we're going to get to the third day, right? And we'll get that. What's missing? Remember, what we had was separation, naming, and then it's good, right? There's no it's good here. And the reason that there's no it's good here is because this is a intermediate step towards something more complete. It's unfinished. This stage of creation, right? So we're going to go on, and we're on verse 11, right, I'm sorry. Um, oh, I am, yes, here we go. Okay, verse 9. Now God says, again, a divine plan, Yikavu hamayim, let the waters come together under the sky, right? To El Makom Echad, to one place, right? And the Tira Hayavasha, and the earth will become visible, right? So this is the next stage of creation. We have water on top, water on the bottom, the water on the bottom being gathered together. The Hebrew word is actually yikavu, right? The same word as mikvah, right? The mikvah is a gathering of waters in a sense. And now the land appears. It was always there, but it was covered by water. And then it says, we get the naming, and God called the land, the dryness, land, and the collection of waters, God called seas. And then God saw it and said, it is good. So we get the it is good here, but we don't get it until we also have heaven and earth. We need the earth. Now it's completed, even though, it took longer, right? You have this sense that one day was not enough to get heaven and earth. We have to get to the second day. But we haven't ended that. We have to get to the third day. We haven't ended it yet. And now God says, let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. And the earth brought vegetation, seed-bearing plants, of any kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit, the seed in it. And God saw this was good. And it was evening and it was morning of the third day. So the third day not only brings us land, but all the vegetation on the land. And then it says, so it said when the land came up, it was good. And then it said in the same day, when it says that all the vegetation and the trees and everything else were created, it was good. So on the third day, it says it was good twice. So the third day, right, is Tuesday. Actually starts Monday night, right? There's a tradition, a Jewish tradition, and you see it widely among more Haredi Jews. You get married on Tuesday, or you get married on Monday night. Why? It said it was good twice. It's a double blessed day, right? I mean, people get married on certain days for all kinds of reasons, right? So that I just think that's kind of cool. One other thing that I should have mentioned before, and I should mention it at least now. Notice how it describes the days. It was evening, then it was morning. And of course, that makes sense because we went from darkness to light, right? But this is where we get the idea that the day begins at night, right? You want to talk about when is Rosh Hashanah going to start? Well, it starts Wednesday night. Right? It's observed this year on a Thursday and Friday, but it starts Wednesday, right? Yom Kippur starts at night with Kol Nidre, right? The days begin the night before. And it's biblical. It comes from here. It's something that the non-Jewish world has a lot of trouble understanding. Can't quite. And we live in two worlds, right? So we have to keep reminding ourselves of one and the other. So Beth and I, many years ago, were in Israel. We were engaged. We were invited by some people we knew. We met on Long Island in West Hempstead. And I was the rabbi there. She was a member of the congregation. And eventually we went off to Israel. We became engaged there. Anyway, some people from that community invited us for Thanksgiving. It's very nice because you're American, you're in Israel, you're going to celebrate Thanksgiving. But we got confused and thought it was the night before. Yeah, we knew better, but somehow being in that Jewish context, right? In the evening and in the morning, that's how the day goes. Okay. Anyway, let's see. We have a little bit of time. I think we can get to the fourth day. Now, what we're going to see is that the first 3 days of creation are now going to be mirrored by the next 3 days. And to give you the first example, the first day, what did we have? Light. The fourth day, now may there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night, and they will be as signs for the set times, the days and the years, and they will be in lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth. And so it was, right? So on the fourth day, we get luminaries. We didn't have them before, but it's all about light, right? That's the fourth day. And then God makes 2 great lights. This is odd. The Hebrew it says, God created Shnei Me'orot HaGedolim, the 2 big lights. The big light to rule over or control or dominate the day, and the smaller light to dominate the night and the stars. So it seems like it refers to them first as both of them as big, and then later one of them is now referred to as small. And there's a lovely midrash that God originally creates them both the same size. And then there is this idea, can a king really wear 2 crowns? And so the moon gets diminished, which is unfair to the moon. And therefore we have a new holiday, which will be celebrated later on, Rosh Chodesh, where we celebrate once a month. We celebrate the moon to make up for the fact that the moon was diminished after it was created. It's a lovely midrash. Of course, not here. It's not biblical at all. The rabbis, I think, can be playful, and that is a playful midrash. Now, the idea that they serve as a sign for the set times, the days and the years. Now the sun and the moon are the ones that are going to let us know when it's day and night, right? And the moon is also going to let us know about the months, right? Each month is a full cycle of the moon in the Jewish calendar. It's a lunar calendar rather than the solar one that we use. It actually is a lunar calendar becomes corrected according to the sun so that the holidays all fall out in the seasons that they're meant to fall out. You can't have Passover as the holiday of spring if it's allowed only by a lunar calendar. It'll kind of move around the year. It's actually what happens with the Muslims and Ramadan, right? It moves around the year. Okay, so these, the sun and the moon and the stars, and they probably, ancient people viewed the planets as stars. They're the other lights in the sky. There's no separate word for planets. And God has done that, and God sets them in the sky to shine upon the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness, And here we go. So God did it. God separated, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning of the fourth day. All right. So let's move on to the fifth. God says, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So the imagery here is that everything is spawned out of the water. Flying things, the living creatures, everything comes out of the water, or it's going to come out of the earth. And birds come out of the water. And God saw this was good, and God blessed them. Be fruitful, and fill the waters of the sea, and let birds increase on the earth. So God not only creates them, or creates, God doesn't actually, God says that the water should bring them out, but God looks at them and tells them to multiply. Now we're with life, there's not going to be any more sun and moon. That's it. But God gets it going and then lets it go on. And the idea is that they should fill everything up, right? Spread out, evening and morning of the fifth day. And now we're going to get to God saw that it was good. And notice that the idea of being fruitful and multiply is not a commandment here. God doesn't command them. God blesses them. Now, that's going to be important when we come to the creation of human beings, because God will bless them again. And I don't know that we'll see. We may get to it. Maybe we'll get to it and then I'll come back to it. But God will bless them also to be fruitful. So the question then becomes, is that a commandment? It's a blessing. Are they the same thing? That is to say, do people have an obligation to have children? Right? Because if we say that it's a blessing, we're saying, it's one of the gifts of God. That's not quite the same thing as saying, right, to be a parent is a divine gift. It's not the same thing as saying, you shall have children, right? And it becomes an interesting question in Jewish law as to whether, when God commands Adam and Eve, blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply, whether this is the first mitzvah in the Torah or not. Okay, we'll come to that. Okay, so we filled up the oceans, the sky, and now we get to the earth. And now God says, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, creeping things, wild beasts of every kind, right? We've moved from the water to the land. Again, we're mirroring here in the third and fourth days of creation, day 1 and 2. And it was so, God made wild beasts of every kind, cattle of every kind, all kinds of creeping things, and God saw that it was good. And now we get the creation of human beings, right? They are the last things to be created, which leads to this wonderful midrash, which says you can either say about human beings, they are the pinnacle of creation, right? We're up here, or even the worm was created before you. Right. So there's this this sense in which we should be filled with a sense of worth. We also have to have humility. Right? And that's the rabbinic way of kind of getting at that. Okay. So now let us make man in our image. according to our likeness. We could spend a whole session on this verse, right? And I'm going to just say a couple of words about it, and then we're going to start with it next time. Because in the 6 minutes that we have left over, and I want to leave you some. No, I'm not even going to start, because I do want to leave you some time for questions, if there are any. So let me ask you for that at this point. Everything up to the creation of human beings. Any questions on anything we've looked at? Sandy, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Just a comment. It's true, Tuesday is doubly good because we have your class.
Suck up. I have to remember that the worm was created before me. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments, Saul?
Yeah, when you said be fruitful and multiply, in the Hebrew it's peru uravu, which are commands.
No, right. You could see it that way, except that it's modified with the word bless. Right? Let me go back to it. Yeah.
They could say sheyifru, that they should be fruitful.
All right, that's
Okay.
it's yes. Okay. I take your point, but I do think that the word blessing, right, v'yivarech otam, takes it out of that category. When you say that a command is itself a blessing, it's not the same thing as a command. But thank you for that correction, because it's an important one. Any other comments, thoughts, suggestions? Okay. Well, so we've begun. We've begun with the beginning. We meet next week at 11:30. I'm glad to see you. There are people who used to come regularly who are not here. So I'm going to try to find out if this is about the time. And I'll be sending out, when I send out the email with the recording, I'll ask that and people can reply. If I don't hear a significant response, no, next week's going to be at 11. I'm not going to change it at this point. And then, because of the holidays, we're going to be taking a short break anyway. So the question is, what time will we resume after the holidays? Now, when I send out the email, if this time really isn't good for you, then you should reply and let me know that, even though you're able to make it, and then I'll consider that also. So in the meantime, have a great week. It's a pleasure to see you, and we'll get people made next time. All right, everyone.
A pleasure to see you too, Rabbi.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, you said that next week it's at 11. Is that what you meant?
No, I meant 11:30. Yes. Yeah. Next week will definitely be 11:30.
Next,
I'm not
11:30.
gonna change it. I might change it once we get through the holiday. Okay? Great.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank